Not too long ago, I released a video that was basically a short review of Pirate Yakuza that only lasted about 11 minutes. And I tried to be as vague as possible, trying to keep it as spoiler-free as possible so that anyone can watch the video and get an idea of what to expect and also what I think of the game. However, that also meant that it was really difficult to give examples and explain just why exactly I said some things about certain aspects of the game. So, while that video remains up for anyone who wants a concise but spoiler-free take, I also really wanted to make a more in-depth version of said review so that I can really talk about any and all things without restraint. That way I can be much more clear about my stance on the different things about the game. So, welcome everybody to the longer version of the review of Pirate Yakuza. Now, given what I just said, this will obviously contain spoilers, so if you're still avoiding these, then maybe check out the shorter version of the review if you haven't already seen that. And if you maybe prefer the podcast format, I also have an episode dedicated to Pirate Yakuza out now where I sit down with other Yakuza content creators and discuss our thoughts on the game, but this video will obviously be much more focused. Setting that aside, we'll be going through my overall thoughts on the gameplay, its ups and downs, and then the story, its pacing, and I'm intentionally going to start with the gameplay because that's much more clear-cut and straight to the point compared to the story discussion. The story is just a topic that is usually much more subjective and more difficult to talk about. Real quick, I just want to say thank you to Sega, RGG Studio, and Hello Guillotine for giving me the chance to make all the Pirate Yakuza content. Now join me as we talk extensively about Pirate Yakuza. One of the first things anyone might think after beating the game, or even before beating the game, is Pirate Yakuza better than Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man who erased his name, given that they both are Gaiden games in nature? And the answer is really dependent on what you wanted out of this game. I think there are some things Pirate Yakuza does better gameplay-wise to Gaiden and vice versa, starting with one of the central elements of gameplay, the combat. In Pirate Yakuza, you have the Mad Dog style as well as the Sea Dog style. Pirate Yakuza's Mad Dog blends Yakuza 0's Thug style with the Mad Dog style from the same game to give an even quicker and more chaotic result. Upon testing out the rush combos, you'll notice that it goes up to 5 light attacks. The quick multi-hits that previously were at the end of Yakuza 0's Thug style are no longer there. However, heavy attacks now have a lot of multi-hits that differ from Thug style's multi-hits. Whereas Yakuza 0's Thug multi-hits were all quick jabs, Pirate Yakuza's multi-hits are a flurry of slashes. So technically, you can still do the rush combos with the heavy attack finishers just like before, but now the heavy attack distinction feels a little less clear because of all the slashes you're able to do. Mind you, before the flurry of slashes, each rush combo still has a unique heavy attack finisher as you would in an average Yakuza game, but by themselves, they aren't nearly as heavy-hitting as you might be used to. Having said that, the flurry of slashes is actually not that bad, because I noticed that in plenty of fights, they can actually deter hyper armor to an extent, which, needless to say, is extremely helpful. So in a way, it feels like rush combos were simplified, and yet there's still outcomes from them that may be more favorable than others depending on the situation. You're still able to grab, but for some reason, it automatically transitions to a back grab. But in general, being able to grab is still handy because you're still able to pull off environmental heat actions. Light attack, heavy attack, and the grab buttons all are chargeable and do different things. Light attack does an elbow uppercut that launches enemies into the air and allows you to further combo them. And speaking of air combos, that's also where a brand new mechanic comes into play. Jumping. Jumping is technically a completely new thing. In the Judgment games, you were able to use the walls to jump off and do attacks, but you couldn't jump the same way you could in Pirate Yakuza. Actually, that may be a bit of a lie, because in Lost Judgment you have the Sky Dancer ability that allows you to jump to avoid attacks. But again, you can't use it the same way you use jumping in Pirate Yakuza. Maybe another example that would be the closest to this actually would be in Lost Paradise with Kenshiro, where you can make use of jumping in extreme heat mode, but it still functions differently than Pirate Yakuza. With Pirate Yakuza, you jump much higher than Lost Judgment, and you can also do directional dodges mid-air, which can be extremely helpful depending on the situation. You could use them to close the gap between you and an enemy, you could use them to dodge guns, you could use them as a means of traversal, and so on. It's just a really fun mechanic and one you may be making use of again and again. But back to air combos, so if you launch enemies with holding light attack, you'll be able to jump up and combo them. Much like with grabs, you have 3 outcomes up there, with light attack, heavy attack, and grab. Light attack pulls off hand-to-hand attacks, while heavy attack pulls off knife attacks. And then the grab button will have you throw out a whole bunch of demon fire daggers, very similar to the Majima summon in Yakuza Like a Dragon. You could mix and match some of the inputs to see varying outcomes as well. For example, heavy attack can result in a powerful kick finisher if you do a few light attacks first, like so. Something that I really like to do is air dodge towards the enemy after I send them flying with that kick, so I don't have to run up to them manually. Back to the ground, I believe you can do up to 3 dodges in total once you have the upgrades, while with Sea Dog you can only dodge up to 2 times with upgrades. The stab counter is also present, although I think the timing might be a little more finicky compared to Yakuza 0. There's also a new counter they added that uses a full heat bar, but only if you do Perfect Guard first. So Perfect Guard is a skill that allows you to break the enemy's attack spree if you guard at the right time, leaving them vulnerable and open to attacks, which can be pretty handy. So right when you pull off Perfect Guard, you use heavy attack and you get a bit of a fancy animation sequence. Sea Dog also has a counter like this, but we'll talk about that style in a bit. Going back to charge attacks, holding heavy attack will result in a big stab move that can hit multiple enemies, and like all the charge attacks, this can also be upgraded. Holding the grab button will result in Majima's iconic blade spin move, which is pretty decent for groups. You're able to do dodge attacks in this game, but there's also a neat twist to it that is worthy of a small bit of praise. You can do a light attack dodge, which results in the same dodge attacks as Yakuza 0's thug style, or you can do heavy dodge attacks, which results in the knife being used instead. I like having this duality, and I feel like it could have been easily a case where we only have one or the other, but we got both. You're able to taunt in this game much like your average Yakuza game, and to my knowledge, the taunt animations here are actually new. But what's strange to me is that there's no heat generation from taunting. Not even with upgrades, like it's just not an option at all. It's one of the things about this game's combat that just strikes me as odd. Like, did they forget about this? Was this intentional? I don't know, but we're just so used to having a small heat increase after taunting, which makes them very worthwhile to use, and now it's just not here. One more thing before we move on to Sea Dog. You have something in this game called the Madness Gauge, which works almost exactly like Kiryu's Rage ability in Yakuza 5. Over time, this gauge in the corner will fill up, and you can do specific things that can actually increase it faster, such as heat actions or certain charged attacks, assuming of course you have the upgrades needed. Once you enable this mode, Majima will spawn clones of himself that will temporarily aid you in the fight, acting independently from you. This is extremely helpful when you feel like the odds are stacked against you, or just in general. You can increase the amount of clones spawned with upgrades, and also with the use of a specific ring, you can have a couple of the clones imitate actions that you are doing. Sea Dog can do another thing with the Madness Gauge, but first let's talk about that style as a whole. So Sea Dog is a brand new fighting style. It makes use of multiple tools such as the dual cutlasses, the flintlock pistol, and the hook. The dual blades are the main tool here, being used in rush combos more than the others. Similar to the Mad Dog style, you can press light attack up to 5 times before you finish them with heavy attack inputs. This style has heavy attack finisher extensions that you can unlock as well. And also similar to Mad Dog, holding each attack button results in something. Holding light attack will have you throw your blades in front of you, damaging enemies in a boomerang kind of motion before they return to you. The interesting part is that while this is happening, you will be able to attack with your fists temporarily. But the real intrigue is when you realize that you're able to use Yakuza 0's regular rush combos here specifically, as in the heavy attack finishers are those of Yakuza 0, and you can do that with Mad Dog style in this game. You have a very limited time window to pull these off, so it's difficult to actually put them to proper use. Though it is worth mentioning that there is a ring that extends the time that your blades will go out flying, so maybe this is more viable when you have that ring on. Holding triangle will result in Majima charging his flintlock pistol to damage multiple enemies with it. This is hands down one of the best options for crowd control because upgrading this ability will have you damage multiple opponents at the same time and increase your heat bar by an insane amount in such a short time. So I highly recommend doing it as soon as possible. You also send enemies flying away to such ridiculous distances and it's just so fun to look at. Holding circle will have Majima use the hook. He'll grab onto an enemy and close the gap between them. This can have multiple outcomes. The default one is you closing the gap and then damaging the enemy up front. Then there's an outcome you can unlock that has you slash through the enemy to damage multiple enemies. There's also a heat action you can unlock related to the hook for a singular enemy which does a lot of damage. And finally, one hand to use is being able to use the hook to move behind the enemy. Now, getting back to the madness gauge, you might be wondering what this style's ability with that is. Introduced by progressing through the main story, you'll come across these musical artifacts that, when played, will summon a dark god that aids you in battle. These are a decent tool for crowd control. The first one that's unlocked by default is a shark god summon, and then you can unlock 3 others by progressing through the Devil Flags side story, which has you fight this notorious pirate group that possesses the rest of the instruments. The 3 other summons are a bird god, a monkey god, and lastly, a jellyfish god. Each of these summons has their own unique effect. The shark god swims around enemies and damages them. The bird god conjures a tornado that is extremely helpful for throwing the enemies off balance. The jellyfish god electrocutes the enemies a couple of times, stunning them and giving you the chance to damage specific enemies. And finally, the monkey god will punch around enemies for you. Out of all the summons, I think the bird summon might take the cake for being the most useful one all around. The tornado actually lifting enemies up into the air and scattering them does wonders in big fights. But I gotta say, one major complaint about summoning is that you initiate an animation that leaves you super vulnerable to attacks, and this is especially noticeable in the big, chaotic fights. So you may end up losing more HP than you really needed to, and that's why it's a good idea to keep a safe distance before doing so. Next, I want to talk about launchers specifically, which is any move that will launch an enemy into the air for you to combo. So as we mentioned earlier, holding light attack in Mad Dog style will result in one such launcher. Another option in Mad Dog is light attack 5 times and heavy attack once. As for Sea Dog, you have light attack 3 times, heavy attack 1 time, and then light attack 4 times and heavy attack 1 time. To my knowledge, this is the extent of the available launchers, but please do correct me if I'm wrong. I think for a game like this, we have a good enough number of them. Much like Lost Judgment and Gaiden as well, boss counters make a return here. And just like Gaiden, you can unlock extensions for the counters for both styles. Might be worth noting though, I feel like both boss counters feel very similar. Like both of them target the boss only, and it doesn't really matter which one you use. It would have been more creative to have one of them be more leaning towards crowd control, just like the Crane boss counter in Lost Judgment. Outside of all the new air combos, you're actually able to do the more familiar juggles in this game as well. They're just kind of trickier to pull off compared to the air combos. When you have an enemy launched, you basically just have to wait a little bit until they're at the right elevation for you to go in. Though I gotta say, it doesn't feel like you have as many options for these kinds of juggles. Most of what you can do is just light attacks until they completely fall down. But you can style switch and mix it up a little bit, which I guess is something. Also, I know for a fact that you have ways to reset these juggles. I haven't dabbled too much in that myself, but I've seen people use the jump and Sea Dog's hook to accomplish that. They'll work on normal enemies, but for bosses, you sort of have a limit as to how much you can keep them up in the air before they dodge away from that state. Honestly, I didn't expect to be able to indefinitely air combo bosses anyway. I think that would kind of make a lot of fights so much easier than they already are. Having said that, you really don't have that many options for air comboing bosses, so I wish that at least was a bit more expansive than it is. My go-to air combo for bosses once they're in the air is with the Mad Dog style, using light attack 2 or 3 times and then heavy attack to send them flying, which is a decently satisfying air combo. When it comes to heat actions, there's a whole slew of them returning from previous games as well as several new ones. I'm not going to cover every single one, but in total, the amount of heat actions in this game is much lower than your average Yakuza game. Since you're able to grab in the Mad Dog style, you have a bunch of environmental heat actions for starters. You also have the wall and table hand stab heat actions from Mad Dog style. You got the iconic heat action from Yakuza 0 that deals damage with 3 enemies, though in this game you have to be in low HP in order to use it, whereas previously you just needed 3 enemies near you and enough heat. And then in Kiwami 2's Majima Saga, you just had to have had a full heat bar and 3 enemies near you. I really don't know why they keep switching around the requirements or conditions to be able to do certain moves. I truly want to see them just keep stuff like this consistent. It's like with Gaiden out of nowhere making bounding throws an extreme heat mode exclusive ability, like, what? This will tie into a topic that I'll talk about later, where I feel like there may be some sort of lack of communication within the dev teams of this series. But anyway, you got the single target knife hit action from Yakuza 0. They brought back the amazing neck break hit action, which I'm really thankful for because I love this one. There's also a new hit action that makes you use your shadow clones, where they and you gang up on a single enemy, which is great. My only complaint is that there's a couple of snippets in there that could be trimmed out to make it shorter. Then there's a new hit action that is very situational, where you use a jetpack, and I think these jetpacks can only be found on the beach in Hawaii. I'll be honest, I'm not a super big fan of heat actions that require you to be in a very specific spot, because that just means you can't use them anywhere else. But yeah, I think that's most of Mad Dog's heat actions. Now, bafflingly, you don't have ground heat actions, which is a big callback to Yakuza 6. I didn't think they would do it again, but for some mysterious reason, they did. It's one of the most basic things about Yakuza's combat, and all they had to do was reuse Majima's ground heat actions from Yakuza 0. I would have taken that. Moving on to Sea Dog's hit actions, one of the first ones you'll be able to use requires you to run towards 3 enemies. It's a brand new hit action, and it's one of the quicker hit actions in this game, and it also deals a fair amount of damage. You can unlock 4 others through upgrades. Sidearm Shuffle is a very good single target hit action that makes use of all the Sea Dog style tools in a very stylish way, and it also deals an insane amount of damage to an enemy even without any attack upgrades. I like this hit action a lot. You got Rain of Blood, which requires you to fully charge your flintlock pistol at 5 or more enemies to be able to use it. You got Skip Rope Slash, which requires a downed enemy and 2 enemies standing near him, damaging a total of 3 enemies. And finally, we got Deadly Skies, which is an area-specific heat action that I would say is way more useful than the jetpack heat action, since you can only use this one in ship battles, which you'll be doing a lot of anyway. This one apparently will damage between 4 to 10 enemies at random. Pretty handy for multiple targets. Also, a big shout out to all the tag heat actions you can do in this game. You can do one with Jason, which is just absolutely amazing. Masaru has a pretty funny one, and then you can also do one with Saejima, which is basically the blade kill move, which Majima and Saejima both do on you in Yakuza Like a Dragon. So just amazing stuff. A small shout out to blocking in this game. I think in both styles you have an Omni Guard, which is basically just being able to guard from all directions. And you're also able to block weapons, which is very good. But sadly, you don't have the trusty Re-Guard ability, which, much like a whole bunch of other abilities, I really don't think there was any reason to exclude it. One nitpick I'll also talk about is the sort of false idea you may get looking at a specific part of the start menu. And I'm talking about this sidearms section. This might give you the impression that you might be able to find other variants of the blades or the flintlock pistol or the hook for the Sea Dog style as you progress through the game. But there is no such thing. It kind of just takes up space of the start menu. I didn't expect Ishin levels of crafting or anything. Heck, I don't want Ishin levels of weapon crafting if anything. But I think it would have been awesome to add cool looking alternatives to your Sea Dog weapons that don't even necessarily have to buff you a crazy amount. Just a nice little effect like maybe plus 5% faster heat gain, and a cool design that you can see in fights and cutscenes, much like how the rings themselves work. And speaking of the rings, let's talk about those. The rings are one of my favorite additions to this game. They are a very creative replacement for your usual armor, pieces, and accessories. And the best part is that you can actually see them on Majima's hands. They'll grant anything from attack buffs, defense buffs, weapon-related defense buffs, and other really helpful effects like increasing item drop rate or faster attacks. There are so many neat little effects that will cater to different things you may want to have at certain times. One of my favorite rings is the Champion's Ring, which is obtainable once you beat this game's Ammon. This might make you think of the previous game's Champion's Ring, but it's actually vastly different. Its main charm is that it will give you gradual heat increase during combat, making it this game's War God talisman. With this ring, your heat bar will refill in like 2 seconds, so needless to say, this is extremely powerful. Another neat example is the Hannya ring set. It's basically 3 different rings that, when equipped, makes your rush combos and Mad Dog faster. And as far as I know, you can stack that with the perfect dodge ability that you can acquire, which also makes your attack faster. I think overall, we got a very good selection of ring effects, but I also expected just a little more that I was surprised wasn't already included. For example, to my knowledge, there is no ring that disables encounters, which is an effect that is available in many of the previous games through an accessory. Usually it was an item called the Beads of Good Fortune that gave you that effect. and it was really nice to have in case you wanted to save yourself some time. Going back a bit to what I said about the perfect dodge, I do wish that the attack speed effect could carry over to Sea-Dog if you switched styles, but sadly I don't think it does, and Sea-Dog doesn't have a perfect dodge bonus to begin with. Speaking of upgrades as a whole, a whopping 36 out of 87 are just health and attack upgrades. Now speaking about myself, I got through the whole game, including the Coliseum and the Ammon fights, without a single attack upgrade. Though I did make use of rings that boosted my attack, and I found them to be more than good enough if I really needed an attack boost. The good thing about ring boosts as well is that you can just remove them anytime you want to, which you can't say the same about the attack upgrades. You have 12 shared abilities that work in both styles, such as the dodge extension, the quick knockdown recovery, and perfect guard. Some of these, like the dodge extension and the perfect guard, are pretty good, but you have a couple of other abilities that honestly just makes me ask why they were even included to begin with. Because there's a whole bunch of abilities that aren't in this game that could have been in this game, like, again, Regard. To give an example of an ability that I pretty much never used, you have this grab counter, which I don't think I used a single time in my almost 50 hours of playing this game. You know what would have been slightly more useful? Having the classic taunt heat gain ability. There's an ability that increases your recovery at restaurants, and I find this one to also be extremely useless, especially when right under it you have the ability to eat as much as you want in restaurants, if you want help with completing them. You really won't be desperate for cash enough for the increased restaurant recovery ability to come in clutch. I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent, but I feel like we're far enough into the franchise that by this point, we should already have the option to refund abilities in these games now. Sometimes you might want to take away certain abilities to challenge yourself, or maybe you invested more into the attack stat than you wanted and now you destroy everything with so much ease. Having ability respeccing is such a handy feature that will encourage people to play around with different upgrades and certain sets of abilities, but as it stands with Yakuza, you have to pretty much restart from scratch if you want to take away any ability that you either no longer want or want to temporarily remove. I really hope that going forward this is something they will consider adding in one of the games. Anyway, one more thing I want to talk about a little more is the counters you're able to do. I already brought them up earlier briefly, but Mad Dog and Sea Dog each have two different counters, one that is heat reliant and one that isn't heat reliant. The Mad Dog normal counter is the same stab one from Yakuza 0, and then you have the Hannya dance, a counter that needs a full heat bar and perfect guarding, but once pulled off you'll have a whole fancy animation play out. It's like a pseudo heat action or a pseudo boss counter. As for Sea Dog, both counters are reliant on perfect guarding. One is just not heat reliant while the other needs a full heat bar. Having said that, trying to pull off any of these counters is kinda weird. At first I thought I had no problems triggering them, but of course now that I'm talking about them in a video, I actually had trouble getting them to happen. Maybe there's just something about their description that I'm misunderstanding, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of point that out. They're kind of jank to pull off. A small update, but I think I understand why I had trouble doing it now. It took me longer than it should have, but I guess the heat required counter specifically needs guard breaking moves that have the enemies glow white like this for you to be able to do these counters. I tried going for that just now and I think I got the counter to work way more consistently. So yeah, there's that. One of the main attractions of this game is all the content that has to do with your own pirate ship. You're able to sail the seas with your crewmates, fight other pirates along the way, discover islands with treasure lurking within them, and claim said treasures for yourself. Early in the story, you clash with a pirate and then proceed to take over his ship, that pirate being Jack the Collector. You initially have a rather small ship, and then after a certain story point, it becomes expanded with a lower floor that houses all the crewmates you end up gathering for your ship. Your ship is essentially a portable hideout of sorts that you can also use to travel to all the different areas of the game, such as Medlantis, Hawaii, Rich Island, and Nelly Island. There's a whole bunch of combat-focused upgrades you can get, such as laser cannons, energy cannons, freeze round turrets, and so on. As for the sea navigation, it's a little overwhelming at first because there's a lot of buttons you could use. For example, you can switch perspectives as you navigate the ship, which doesn't change anything per se, but it's an option and I kinda like that it's there. The ship speed, I would say, feels pretty slow, and I get that it's probably the way it is for immersion purposes, but I still find myself wishing I could go faster sometimes. Even with the turbo boost feature that speeds up your ship, it sometimes still feels like you're not fast enough. Out on the sea, you'll have these rings you can sail through for a free speed boost. And they usually also have either turbo gas pickups in between or resources that you may want to get. While navigating, you can leave the wheel and walk around the ship if there's anything you want to do. Some of the things you can do on the ship include planting seeds to get some vegetables that you can use in cooking, and you can also hang a net that will accumulate resources for you. In the captain's quarters, you can sing karaoke anytime you'd like. You can also throw a feast for your crew members to level them up faster and improve their morale if needed. An additional way to improve their morale is to directly gift someone something. Throwing a feast requires special meals for that purpose, and you can prepare them on the lower floor in the kitchen. Cooking is an activity that you can do in this game where you can make special dishes for yourself and also for the crewmates. You'll be able to gather ingredients in all the different places in the game to use here. It's a good incentive to always go around and grab whatever you see. So this gives you an idea about sea exploration and what you can do in the ship itself already. So now let's talk about the ship combat specifically. You have quote-unquote random encounters out on the sea that will have you fight other ships. You'll be able to use multiple things to damage the other ships. One of those things is a turret, which is the main way to damage enemies, and then you have cannons on the left and the right sides of the ship, though using those will require maneuvering around the enemy in a way where you likely won't be able to use the turret, which is placed at the very front. In combat, you can still make use of the turbo boosts, which can give you a big advantage in dodging incoming attacks, or even drifting strategically, trying to get a right angle for an attack. Using turbo boosts to ram into a ship directly is also an option, and sometimes it's pretty viable for a direct approach. You also have a rocket launcher that you can fire directly at ships, but I honestly don't recommend this option most of the time because it requires you to stop controlling the wheel and basically expose yourself to the enemy. In bigger ship battles that aren't just random encounters, such as Coliseum fights or certain story fights, a ship battle is only the first half of the overall fight. Once you win the ship battle, you have an onboard fight against the enemies where you personally drop down on them with your crewmates for a big all-out fight. These fights are fairly fun and chaotic as well. You can assign support members that give you the ability to trigger buffs or heals very similar to how in Gaiden, the Coliseum there had a buff prompt that charged itself over time. Only difference is you can't customize that buff in Gaiden, but in here you can. It's essential that you gather as many powerful crewmates as you can so you don't have a hard time in these fights. There's a lot of returning characters for crewmates as well as a bunch of new ones. The story direction already has you recruit people as part of the objectives, but you still need to train them a bit, and trust me, you won't regret it. You can get different crewmates either through finding them on the map and just going up to them, or buying them as a reward in certain minigames or through sub-stories. And of course you also have a bunch of DLC crewmates. Overall, the ship combat isn't bad at all. It can be annoying here and there, and at times you might feel like it's repetitive, but it's alright for RGG's first attempt at something like this. This studio likes to experiment every now and then, and these experiments may or may not click with people. But anyway, aside from the navigation speed, one complaint that I have is that I wish the first mate that you assign actually does something around the ship. Because if somebody falls down in combat, you'll have to leave the wheel, run up to them, and get them up by yourself. You're able to use a smokescreen that'll hide you from enemy sight temporarily, which helps a lot when you're trying to revive teammates. But I think it would have been ideal if the first mate either went around to revive members for you, or maybe they could have taken the wheel as you revive others. Heck, maybe make use of the rocket launcher because I found myself to be using it very little. The best time to make use of it in my experience is when you have a smokescreen already up, and there's still a bit of time before it expires. So here you want to shoot the rocket launcher once or twice, and then after that you just go back to the wheel. Oh, and one more thing. In the later Coliseum fights, you have ships that can launch homing rockets at you, and also throw out sea mines. The fact that you are unable to use these tools is kind of frustrating, to be honest. You can do pretty much anything enemy ships are capable of, except these two. Drifting away from sea navigation, I want to talk about just plain old exploration. Going around on your own 2 feet, or I guess using the Segway as well, counts. But the point is, I want to talk about exploring the cities and lands that Pirate Yakuza has to offer. As mentioned, we have 4 different areas: Hawaii, Medlantis, Rich Island, and Nelly Island. I'll just say this right now. Nelly Island is barely an area. It's like 2 rooms in total, and outside of story purposes, there's really not much to it. Rich Island comes after it in terms of size. It's a very small place, but it's bigger and has a couple of things you can do in there. Then we have Medlantis, which you can say is this game's version of the castle. There's multiple things you can do here, and I like the flashy and dirty look of this area. Finally, you have Hawaii in its entirety. and naturally, Hanoae has the most for you to do. One of the big questions you might be wondering going into this game is, why have all of Hanoae? How are they even gonna make all of it relevant? The simple answer is hunting items. There's a ton of items and hidden treasures laying around both Hanoae and Atlantis as well. Sometimes you'll need to make use of the hook to get yourself up to higher areas to get rare items. Going out of your way to explore is heavily encouraged, and as somebody who loves just roaming around in games, I love that my roaming around gets rewarded like this. Maybe it's just been a while since I played Infinite Wealth, but I dare say they pulled off that aspect better in this game. You'll find everything from ingredients, heals, and on a couple of occasions I even came across rings in some of those briefcases you find laying around. But I think they might just be a very rare drop. Adding on to the previous point with sea exploration, some of the hidden items you can find are treasure chests that have either a ring or a piece of treasure that'll get you money and pirate points on the spot. Money in this game, much like Gaiden, is used to unlock abilities, and pirate points are a secondary currency used for unlocking abilities and nothing else. In Gaiden, you could use Akame points to get some items from her shop, in addition to also unlocking abilities. But in Pirate Yakuza, there is no other use for this secondary currency. While we're on this topic, I do want to just say that I kinda wish we can go back to having an upgrade system similar to Yakuza 4's, or at least the Judgment games. I slightly prefer Yakuza 4's upgrade system because you pretty much have every ability in your skill tree already. You just had to unlock them by leveling up and using the points given. In the Judgment games, however, especially the first one, many of the abilities you had to go out and find, whether that was through QR codes or skill books. The QR codes I can stomach, but some skill books are an absolute pain to get. This is something that I think not many will be able to relate to, but I unlocked everything on Judgment on the initial PS4 release, and then after the PC version came out, I basically had to redo everything all over again. Heck, even now I think I still don't have all the abilities in Judgment, so I just wish they cut that tedium and once again give us an upgrade system that was as pleasant as Yakuza 4's. That one was aesthetically pleasing with its different protagonist colors, and it was just a good time overall. Truly the peak. Pirate Yakuza's upgrade system is story progress gated, meaning you aren't able to unlock certain abilities right away. You have to play more and also increase your pirate rank, which goes up to 5 stars. It does the job given that side content is sort of mandatory in this game, but I'm not the biggest fan of this execution. Another aspect of exploration is bounties. If you enjoyed Yakuza 3's Hitman missions, then you may be pleased to hear that you now have up to a whopping 86 boss-like enemies scattered around Hanoae, Atlantis, and Rich Island for you to hunt down and eliminate. These are an excellent way of making money, especially in the early game where you're gonna be hurting for money the most. Unlike Yakuza 3, you don't have to spend a lot of time hearing info dumps about each of these bosses. It's a very quick process as you're told about their locations and then you just walk up to them and you fight them. Though you do get a wanted poster for each of them in case you wanted to read about their backstories, which are all very brief. The bounties is a feature that I welcome with open arms because combat is one of my favorite aspects about the Yakuza games, and getting to make good money out of it on top of that? Hell yeah, sign me in. Once again though, there is about 86 of these, so for some of you it might feel repetitive at some point. But personally, I just enjoyed the gameplay loop of Pirate Yakuza that I didn't mind it so much. Once you're done with all the bounties, you're given a ring for a reward that is part of a set for faster heat gain in Sea Dog style. Pretty neat stuff overall. One recycled form of content is being able to make friends around Hanoae. You'll be able to greet people and become friends with them on the spot. As was the case with Infinite Wealth, the more friends you make, the more rewards you can get from K in Revolve Bar. Eventually, through making friends, you'll be able to recruit both her and Richardson into your ship crew, which is really neat. And speaking of friends, you'll come across animals that you can try and tame so you can bring them back to a small space back in Rich Island. You can raise your affinity with them by giving them food from time to time, and they'll give you some nice goodies back as well. Setting aside exploration for a bit, we can't talk about the gameplay without mentioning all the side content and the minigames this game has to offer. And oh boy, where do we start? It might be a good idea to get all the recycled or similar ones out of the way first. For instance, all the different gambling minigames are back with little to no change, and to be fair, I don't know what you can change about those. You could say that there's a bit more incentive to do them now, given that some of them have cosmetic rewards behind them, but in most of the gambling places, you can just buy the currency needed and get the items you want from their exchange shop that way, which I do appreciate that, by the way. A couple of exceptions being things like Mahjong or shogi where you actually have to play yourself. But at least with mahjong, you can just use the cheat tile. Cheat items thankfully exist in this game. And with shogi, if you just do the puzzle shogi, you know, there's videos for that on YouTube, you should get enough points to claim all the cosmetics. Other than that, you have golf, claw machines, darts, dragon cart, pool, crazy delivery, sicko snap, and so on. Arcade games are also a thing as usual, with a couple of new additions such as Virtua Fighter 3 and Ocean Hunter. Personally, I almost never visit the arcades in the Yakuza games, but I know that the two examples I mentioned made a lot of people very excited. Amidst all the recycled minigames, a couple of them got a bit of an overhaul, most notably the Batting Center, which now has a pirate theme to it and plays out a bit differently. This is a very welcome change, as I found it to be very fun, especially when you have good rewards you can claim afterwards. They should definitely do more stuff like this. The Coliseum, of course, is present in this game, though it is one of the more unique versions of it, given that a big part of it consists of ship battles. Then you have onboard battles as well, which more closely resembles the all-out fights in Gaiden's Coliseum. You also have a unique category that basically recreates your boss fights with the Devil Flags bosses. I have about 2 complaints with this game's Coliseum. One is that it definitely could have used a 1 versus 1 category if you wanted that classic Yakuza combat rush. And 2, you sadly aren't able to control anyone that isn't Majima in this game, unlike Gaiden. Even though most playable characters had bare-bones movesets in Gaiden's Coliseum, just the idea of having all these playable characters that you can enjoy was incredible. Unprecedented even. I fully expected all the Gaiden games to potentially have this trend where their versions of the Coliseum would give you the option to play as other characters, but it seems that it's a trend that won't necessarily be continued in these smaller titles. Having said that, as fellow Yakuza content creator Gokudoni told me, maybe this isn't so bad because this gives Gaiden an additional point that makes it stand out amongst other games, at least as of now. One thing I do want to talk about is the insane difficulty spike in some of these Coliseum tournaments. I played on Professional and had no problems until the last couple of tournaments on a couple of different categories. The enemies have tools that you aren't able to make use of, and sometimes it feels like there's some RNG involved where if things didn't play out a certain way, then you're probably better off just restarting and trying your luck again. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I lowered the difficulty to be able to get through the annoying ones. Don't take my word for it, but I heard from somebody that reached out to me that the Coliseum fights on Professional are actually bugged. But take it with a grain of salt, as I can't confirm this. We briefly mentioned them before, but the Devil Flags is a group of vicious pirates that you go after as part of this game's major side story, similar to Yakuza 0's Real Estate, where you have several bigwigs that show off and act high and mighty until you progress enough to put them in their places. This side story has you going through different islands with different appearances. I'm really fond of the look of the Flame Islands and the Frost Islands. They look insanely gorgeous, and it just makes me wish you could redo these island fights so you can experience all of it again. But alas, once you're done with this side story, the islands serve no purpose. I assume doing New Game Plus will have you revisit all of these again, so that's something at least. I just want to mention one more time how beautiful these landscapes are. Like, I genuinely stopped and just took in the sights. Absolutely beautiful work. It might be a bit difficult to tell since this is a compressed video on YouTube, but the snow particles look amazing on the Frost Islands. Can I get an amen in chat? Moving on to more familiar territory, the sub-stories. It wouldn't be a Yakuza game if there were no sub-stories, right? Well, this game has a total of 31 sub-stories. I'll admit, I still haven't done all of them. I've only done about 15 of them. A lot of the ones I've done are basically what you'd come to expect from a Yakuza sub-story. You encounter someone that's troubled, you waltz in to save the day, someone rants about their life story with a sad theme in the background, and then everyone's happy ever after. The end. I honestly wish they shake up the formula a little bit, because coming from someone that doesn't at all mind the asset reuse, the sub-stories just aren't that exciting anymore because a lot of them follow a very samey pattern. I will say though, there was one sub-story in particular that kinda made me audibly laugh, and it's actually one that has to do with the Minato girls, particularly the girl in Anaconda Mall where Majima kept trying to talk to her, but every time he wanted to, he had to buy a copy of her book, and then he ends up with a whole box of them. And speaking of the Minato girls, we have to talk about Masaru's harem sub-story, don't we? So, the whole deal with the Minato girls ward is that at some point during the story, you discover that Masaru's been writing in his diary about how lonely he is and how he wants to try to have a love life. So Majima, being the good captain he is, actually goes out to seek the specific type of girl he wrote about. You end up coming across 5 candidates, and then you introduce them to Masaru, and you get one of the most awkward and occasionally funny FMVs in all of Yakuza. Listen, I still don't know where I should start with this. My biggest problem by far with these FMVs is just how much space they end up taking from the overall game size. In Gaiden's case, a whopping 24 gigabytes belong solely to the hostess FMVs, while another 24 gigs belong to the Infinite Wealth demo, which you can't get rid of. Well, you kinda can on PC, so that's something at least. In Pirate Yakuza, it's not as bad, but the Minato Girls FMVs still take about 12 gigabytes, I think. The thing that kinda baffles me is that all these characters are already rendered in-game with actual models, unlike Gaiden where that was not the case. So why didn't they just recreate all of the scenes in-game? My only guess is time constraints, and maybe it would be a little difficult to recreate this comedy in-game, but who knows. Even if they were to recreate all of this in-game, I don't think that would suddenly make this a 10 out of 10 or anything like that. Generally speaking, there's a lot of side content that I just don't mesh with, and hostess type side content definitely falls under that camp. As I said earlier, I'm a much bigger fan of them taking something that already exists and presenting it in a new, more shiny way, like with Pirate Yakuza's batting center. Anyway, one other thing that's in Pirate Yakuza is drink links. You have a bunch of conversations with Noah, Jason, Masaru, Saejima, and even Nishida and Minami. Once you go through all the conversations of a character, you're able to sit down with them and have a heart-to-heart. Very similar to how they're done in Yakuza Like a Dragon and Infinite Wealth. I honestly didn't know if I expected for Nishida and Minami to get this treatment, but I am super happy that they did. My boys deserve all the spotlight. I wanted more content of them in this game, and we got exactly that. The cool thing about these drink links is that once you're done with a character, their rarity as a crew member goes from gold to diamond, going from a maximum level of 40 to 50, becoming much better than they already were. It's refreshing to see them nurture story characters like this and ship-related content, and giving them the respect they deserve. Because to my knowledge, not even the DLC members can have their rarity increased, making the story-related crewmates extremely good to use in any team lineup. Also, very small shout out to the fact that once you increase their level cap, any excess XP they had will carry over, shortening the grind you have to do to get them to level 50. They didn't have to do that, but they did. Saving the best for last, let's talk about karaoke. I briefly mentioned it earlier, but I didn't go into any details. You're able to sing karaoke in your ship as well as in Revolve Bar. There is a total of 8 songs, unfortunately one of them being DLC, though that one also happens to be the shortest one, and it's the Majima construction theme. Now again, it is a shame that they made this a DLC, but I'm glad that they picked this one because you're really not missing out on much with this one. It doesn't have a cool animated clip, and it's likely just a very quick asset rehash more than anything, besides, you know, Majima's voice actor actually singing the song this time. Aside from that one, you have 3 returning ones and 4 brand new ones, so there's a fantastic balance between old and new, and pretty much all the songs are incredible. A big shout out to Midnight Desire though. That song is among my new favorite karaoke songs now. If I had to pick a second favorite, it would be the, I forgot its name, the pirate one. You'll see it on the screen right now, but yeah. I know what you're thinking, watch the YouTuber, oh my god. Disliking and unsubscribing, but please, listen, forgive me, okay? Holy crap, I'm yapping a lot. I could literally just look it up right now and read the name and all that, but no, I choose to yap. Anyway, let's talk a bit about quality of life with this game. So this is a section where I'm gonna talk about various features that I couldn't fit anywhere else in the video, so I think it's best to just kind of gather them all here together. So the things I'm gonna bring up here may vary in nature a bit, and I may even end up sort of bringing up something that I already did earlier, but I'll try to be brief about it. So quality of life is an area where this game makes some steps forward and some steps backwards at the same time. For example, when using the Segway, you can now greet people while using it, making the process of befriending people so much more convenient than Infinite Wealth, where you couldn't do that. Not only that, but greeting people in Infinite Wealth caused Ichiban to slow down to walking pace. But not in Pirate Yakuza. You continue running even while doing that, which once again is a big improvement. Even though it's nothing new, the fast travel convenience that was introduced in Infinite Wealth thankfully remains in this game. So you can hover over any taxi spot on the map as you navigate and choose to fast travel there from the map itself, instead of having to navigate to the taxi taxi app on your phone, or manually walking up to a taxi to move to another spot. This is still one of the best features they've ever introduced, as it saves a ton of time, and I hope they don't get rid of it anytime soon for no reason. And I hope I didn't jinx it by just saying that. Mr. Yukiyama, please! New Game Plus thankfully returns in Pirate Yakuza, though it's not in the base game as far as I know, but has to be downloaded as part of an update. I'm mostly relieved about its inclusion, however I think just having it in the base game as we always did in many of the previous titles is the best case scenario, as there's really no reason not to include it, even in shorter games like the Gaiden ones. Actually, it may be more accurate to say specifically in Gaiden games, given that in both of the Gaiden games we have at the moment, you have multiple points where you need to stop and grind to increase your story rank or gather money and the like before you can proceed. And I would still argue that even with something like the Kaito files, New Game Plus would have been very, very good to have. Having to recollect every new ability in that DLC is a pain. And I just wish we could skip all of that by simply having New Game Plus to begin with. Okay, so I talked about this a couple of times before, but it's still worth bringing up, and I think this would be the right place for it in the video, but the lighting. Compared to pretty much every other Yakuza game, I've seen plenty of others that say it looks really off. Sometimes it'll be too bright and other times it'll be too dark. I don't know if this is an intentional choice. I mean, it had to be if it passed quality testing, right? But I really don't understand how they overlooked this. Infinite Wealth looked just fine even during morning time. I don't remember having brightness and contrast problems like with Pirate Yakuza. Am I crazy? I don't know. Maybe you let me know if you can also relate to this. Ideally, I would hope they fix this in an update, but this is something that I kinda have a feeling that won't be changed. Time will tell, but we will see. A small thing I'm bummed out about is the fact that there's no premium adventure option in the main menu. You know, just in case I want to start anew without worrying about the story. This was pretty much always an option in most Yakuza games, and it really helped if I wanted to record something that I didn't have already. I guess just starting New Game Plus on Pirate Yakuza will still allow me to revisit side content that I want to record, but it will definitely take more time because of all the skipping that I would have to do. Something I'm surprised isn't available is bulk crafting. At Julie's workshop, you're able to craft different materials, and you would think that, you know, for crafting items that you would normally want in higher quantities, you would have the option to craft them in certain big numbers. But to my surprise, no. You have to spam craft whatever thing it is you want multiple times, and it gets old pretty quick. And speaking of bulk crafting, I was really hoping there would be an option to make higher numbers of dishes when it comes to cooking, but sadly you're limited to just 3 of one type of item at a time. I guess the logic behind this one was to have you actually interact with the cooking minigame repeatedly, but I think having at least an option of crafting up to 10 of an item would have still been very nice to have. Something I already mentioned earlier, but I really wish we had a way to disable encounters if we didn't want to deal with them temporarily for any given reason, but sadly I don't think we can do that at all. And speaking of random encounters, you can't disable those out on the sea either. The good thing about the sea encounters is that you can escape them easier than random encounters on land, since every ship encounter has a fixed radius and the fight will cease once you exit that radius. On the other hand, escaping will lower the morale of your crewmates, so you may have to take care of them a bit more than normal. To be honest though, in all my playtime so far, I think I only had to go out of my way to give them gifts for morale a couple of times or so it's not that bad. One thing that I'm sort of sad about is that when it comes to the devil flags and the treasure islands, once you're done with an island, that's it. You can't go back and you can't re-experience those fights on the same playthrough. I assume you'd have to go through New Game Plus to reset it all. It's a bit of a shame because there are multiple biomes that look different and pretty, and I'd love to be able to fight in them again at any given point. As justification for being able to go back, if, you know, we want to go that far, they could just have you fight against treasure-seeking generic pirates now that aren't the devil flags, or something like that. Or maybe remnants of the devil flags that are too stubborn to leave. Much like Gaiden, Pirate Yakuza only has 3 difficulties: beginner, standard, and professional. This kinda seems weird at a first glance since we're used to having at least 4 difficulties, with the last one being called either X-Hard or Legend. Though upon closer inspection, I do think that the balance of this game is pretty much around that level at professional difficulty, so I don't mind it too much. There are some scenarios where you may die very quickly if you're not prepared or careful enough. So, after saying all of this, I kind of want to raise a point or a question that comes from multiple inconsistencies, not just in this game, but also in a game like Gaiden. I can't be the only one who thought this, so let me know if you picked up on it too. Sometimes you have like really weird decisions. You have something like Amon not counting as a sub-story in Pirate Yakuza, taunting not giving you heat, not even as an upgrade option, and the lack of a very basic function, the ground heat action, being limited to a singular heat bar, the lack of a premium adventure option in the main menu, having only 3 difficulties, which Gaiden also did the same thing, the complete removal of healing shortcuts. Let's say for the sake of the argument that heal shortcuts are just a judgment thing. Well, fine, what about everything else that I mentioned? And I feel like there's even more stuff that just don't line up with what we usually come to expect from an average Yakuza game. This kinda leads to a big question mark forming itself on the top of my head. And I can only wonder, is this a sign of some kind of lack of communication within the dev team? Maybe this game just wasn't handled by the main team or something? I honestly have no idea, but I really do hope that they keep all these stuff consistent going forward. What do you think about this though? Am I overthinking it? Well, anyway, I think I said everything that I wanted to say about the gameplay side of Pirate Yakuza. So now, let's move on to the other half of the game. The story. This, without a doubt, is the more controversial part of the game. The part that people are more uncertain about compared to the gameplay side. After all, the premise itself already gives you a very good idea of the course of this game's narrative, and it is somewhat of a departure from what we're used to with this franchise, even when compared to something like Infinite Wealth, which until now was arguably considered the silliest canon game. Depending on what you expect to get out of this game's story, you're either going to be moderately entertained or heavily disappointed. After all, the true reason behind the entire game's premise and the journey you go through is only shown at the very last cutscene of the game. And to have a coherent story that's well connected, you need to have a better hook that keeps people engaged enough early on, going into the middle of the story, until they get to that point. The thing is, leading up to the game's release, I was led to believe that there was going to be a system very similar to Kiryu's in Infinite Wealth, where you recover past memories by reminiscing and coming across certain situations and people, but I was kind of surprised to see that there's no such thing. You don't even have that many flashbacks in the main story either. If I had to describe it in a certain way, this is a game that makes a story out of its gameplay elements rather than the other way around. It's not like the typical Yakuza game where you're presented with a narrative in a structure that you're used to, and has tension and stakes, at least not like until way later in the game. For what it's worth though, I'm really glad they didn't milk certain ideas like, bringing back Makoto again, because I really think they don't need to bring her back anymore. So I'll give this game that. By my current tone, it might sound like I'm just dissing the game outright and, that I'm trying to say it has no redeeming qualities, but not at all. If anything, there's a bunch of ideas this game made use of that I'm really fond of. However, I can't deny that the journey wasn't as focused as I might have expected. The way I see it, it's an experiment. One that I ended up fairly enjoying, but not full-on falling in love with. Does that make sense? Maybe that makes it more understandable. Lately, I noticed something about myself relating to games in general that aren't just Yakuza. There may be a game or more within a given franchise that doesn't offer the conventional kind of story or plot value as the other games. Or at least it may not follow the conventional story beats, and yet, for one reason or another, I end up loving that kind of game more than the average fan. Wink wink, Trails in the Sky the Third. Wink wink, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D. Trails in the Sky the Third, without saying much, is a game in a trilogy that acts more as an epilogue than its predecessors, and yet it offers a whole bunch of substantial plot points despite focusing more on gameplay. And then with the Resident Evil game that I mentioned, that game literally has no story mode. It takes a beloved side mode from the Resident Evil games and makes a whole game around it. You can't get more gamey than that. It's like if RGG Studio decided to make a whole game out of the Coliseum, with an insane roster of playable characters that are fully fleshed out, more arena and tournament options than ever, and so on. RGG Studio, please do that. So because of all that, even with the weaker story of Pirate Yakuza, I absolutely adore this game. Pirate Yakuza has a total of 5 story chapters, including the finale. We'll quickly go through what each chapter brings, and we'll talk about it briefly. Chapter 1 starts the game off with an amnesiac Majima stranded on a random island, struggling to pick himself up. Noah, a boy who lives on the island, comes across Majima and offers him some water. The two come across pirates who threaten them, so now Majima, who still doesn't remember anything, feels like he has to do something to save the boy. He tries fighting off the pirates and manages to do so successfully. He meets Noah's family soon afterwards. There's Jason, Noah's dad, and Moana, Noah's sister, and they own a bar on this island. So one thing leads to another, and Majima ends up befriending this family as well as a pirate called Masaru, who works for a guy called Jack the Collector. We end up having to fight this Jack dude, and then we take over his ship, and Masaru joins our side. As far as first chapters go, I actually think this chapter is one of the better ones in this game, and it is a solid first chapter overall. It's about 3 hours, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, and I think it strikes a decent balance between introduction instructions and gameplay. It also has a very good amount of eye-catching boss fights. Then we go to the dreaded Chapter 2. You must have seen people joke about this chapter by now, and you know exactly what we're talking about if you played the game yourself. This chapter introduces ship navigation, ship combat, islands, before we go to Nelly Island for a bit of story. Right after that is when we go to Medlandis for the first time, introducing a good bunch of side content to you. Then you go to Hawaii, where more side content is waiting for you. At some point, there will be a lock on the story, and you have to go out and make money and also recruit more crewmates in order to be able to progress. So long story short, this is really a side content chapter with some story sprinkled here and there, giving it the notorious reputation that it currently has, and I'm sure it's gonna retain that reputation for a long time. I fully understand the sentiment, and it does make me wish that RGG lets side content stay side content as much as possible. I get that, this being a Gaiden game, they might have wanted to stretch the story pacing as much as possible, but in this case, it might only serve to its detriment. Although, being fair as well, the whole bit about the story being locked behind side grinding is a concept that's been there since the original Yakuza 1, where you had to make at least 300,000 yen to be able to buy the Shangri-La Pass. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that because of that they should keep doing this, but rather the opposite actually. These segments of the games are some of my least favorite parts about the series. They can absolutely demolish the pacing and take you out of the experience, despite the likely well-meaning intentions the devs have of just wanting you to explore the side content. So anyway, once you're done with Chapter 2, Chapter 3 picks up the pace a little bit with proceeding with the story. It's where you learn about potential betrayals and the like, so things get going much quicker than Chapter 2. Some of the best fights in the game are in Chapter 3 as well, such as the long fight going after Tucker, and then the Saejima boss fight. Chapter 4 is just okay. We get the Mortimer fight there, which is pretty good, and then you also have a decent fight against Masaru, but then you have multiple fights with both Keith and Jack the Collector, which honestly at this point, it sort of just felt like they wanted to throw them at you to drag the story a little more. And finally, we have the final chapter. By nature of it being the final chapter, and thus the expectedly most climactic chapter in the game, it has a whole bunch of amazing moments and fights as well. I'd say that this chapter, along with Chapter 1 and 3, are definitely the highlights of the story, with Chapter 2 and 4 being the weakest. A lot of the story characters in this game I actually liked quite a bit. I personally don't think you need to set an entire novel of build-up to have you like a character. So, returning characters like Saejima, Minami, and Nishida were fantastic. Rodriguez turns out to be a bro, same for Shigaki even though he messes up pretty badly. Naomi had a couple of great moments. Moana really should have had more screen time somehow, maybe by joining the pirate crew. Tucker is okay, but he becomes goated for the friendship speech at the end. Queen Michelle is great and just made me think of Lady D from Resident Evil 8, but I do think the way she went out was pretty underwhelming. Mortimer existed just to give you a good fight and then dies in one of the funniest ways possible. Raymond, the final boss, is just okay. Like, I think he's a logical final boss for this game, and while I do love the soundtrack for his fight and the dynamic intro, he's in this weird kind of spot where it's kind of hard for him to be one of the greatest, fights or characters in the whole series. So, as you can see, there's just this pattern with the story where a lot of story beats won't hit. But besides Chapter 2, I'd say the story overall didn't overstay its welcome in a way that annoyed me. And the fact that this is a Dragon Engine game will help it immensely for replays, as in, being able to skip all the dialogue will be extremely convenient. This game feels like it wanted to experiment in many ways, for both story purposes and gameplay purposes, and I can respect that. I don't mind the idea of a gameplay-heavy game once in a while, especially one that isn't particularly tedious like, Pirate Yakuza, because you have a contrast to this game that would be something like Lost Paradise, where doing the side content actually felt like one of history's most brutal torture methods. Also, just talking about the story a little bit more, this game does a surprising amount of lore expansion on Bryce, a character from Infinite Wealth, which I don't know if I expected, but I unironically enjoyed Bryce's character a lot, so this was something that's welcome for me. But yeah, I don't want to go too much into analyzing the story in this video, I just wanted to give a good idea of what's in here and what I thought of the general structure and the direction of it. I didn't mind that the ending wasn't the usual absolute tearjerker, even though we did get a pretty heartfelt scene at the end of the game. The thing is, if every single game is an absolute waterworks show, that's going to get stale eventually, and it'll be what some may brand as slop because it's just the norm at that point. You'll know to expect something heart-wrenching every time with every Yakuza game, and you'll just go, okay, here it comes. It's no different from the repetition in pattern with something like sub-stories, where at this point of time you can guess with like 90% accuracy how an average sub-story will go thanks to the many of the recent established patterns in RGG games. We may not click with one game. There's gonna be games in a franchise that we're just bound to not really click with. And that's okay, that only makes us appreciate our favorites even more and further expands the variety of this series. That's why when I saw the freaking Bollywood-esque outro, I was like, hell yeah, I love this, give me more of this. By the way, that part is obviously non-canon and just for fun, because this fossil wouldn't be able to bust as much of a move as he does in this part, but he does, and it makes the whole thing doubly entertaining. But anyway, I feel like I yapped a lot already, so arriving at the end of this video, I feel like I've said most of what I really wanted to get out of the way for this game for the time being. Pirate Yakuza is a really fun entry that breaks the cycle of what we've come to expect. It's obviously not without its flaws, as mentioned throughout this video, and I do wish they take these flaws into account for the next games. We all look for specific things when we get into a game, and Pirate Yakuza is a relatively gameplay-heavy game compared to the usual Yakuza game. Although, because the gameplay loop here is very entertaining to me, I find myself not minding that focus at all. There's a lot of gameplay to enjoy, and the soundtrack has a good number of bangers, and the story has its moments, and overall, we got a decent package here. As I said in my shorter review video, I would still give this game anywhere between a 7.5 to an 8. What about you guys? Is there anything in this video that I said that you agree with or maybe disagree with? Maybe I brought up something that you may not have initially thought of? Comment down below and let's discuss. As usual, I just want to say thank you so much for giving the video and the channel the time of your day. It really means a lot that you would stop by and just hear me yap about whatever it is that I happen to be yapping about. A like and a sub would help me out immensely, so consider doing those if you haven't already. Now you guys take care, stay safe, and stay healthy. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye now.